Hello and welcome. This is Phuket PALS, back with another GED Social Studies exam, going through question by question, helping you prepare for the GED Social Studies test. As always, please pause whenever needed to look at the infographics or read the text, the questions themselves and answers. Let's begin. Question number 1 starts off with a pretty large text about the 1930s and 1940s. Pause the screen, read it, and then we'll move on to the questions. Okay, so if you've had a chance to read through the text, we can start with question number 1. According to the passage, which of the following was primarily responsible for the end of the Great Depression? A. Federal anti-poverty programs. B. Technological progress. C. Government controls over prices and wages. Or D. The development of a war economy. Have a look there and see if you can find out which is the correct answer. Okay, I'm assuming you paused, so let's get right into it. The correct answer is D, the development of a war economy. In the second paragraph, they emphasize how the war economy was what really got the American family more wealthy, and that was what spurred consumer spending. Moving on to question 2. Which of the following would be the best example of the type of consumer goods that were in demand when the Second World War ended? So, if you understand the basic economics section of what you had to study for the GED test, then you should be able to find an example of consumer goods. Go ahead and look through and see if you can choose. Okay, if you've read through A, automobiles, B, better highways, C, commercial airplanes, or D, railroad passenger cars, it should be pretty obvious that A, automobiles are the only consumer good on the list. Highways aren't even a good, they are an infrastructure project. Commercial airplanes are not consumer goods, therefore businesses. Railroad passenger cars would be either for businesses to purchase or government agencies. Number 3, the United States during the Second World War could be most accurately described as which type of economy? A, a free market economy. B, a managed economy. C, a barter economy. Or D, a monopolistic economy. Go ahead and pause, think about it, and choose your answer. If we look through these answers, it's pretty obvious that 2 of them are not correct. So B is the correct answer. It is a managed economy. The government was managing by setting price controls. It was not a free market economy because the government was interfering. It was not a barter economy because people were using currency and not trading goods or services. And it was not monopolistic because the government was controlling it, not one business. Question number 4. Judging from the way GNP statistics are used in this passage, it can be concluded that one of the primary purposes of the GNP figures is to analyze which? A, population trends. B, employment trends. C, economic trends. Or D, the effects of government regulations on business. Go ahead, pause the video. Think about which one of these you think is the most suitable answer. Look at those GNP statistics. Here. Pause the video, have a look. GNP is mentioned in the first paragraph. Okay, if you've had a chance to pause this and look at it, the correct answer for number 4 would be C. The GNP is used to show economic trends. Although they talk about employment trends, that's not what the GNP is being used to measure. Population trends are irrelevant to this economic conversation. The effects of government regulations on business are discussed, but not in relation to the GNP. The final question for the passage is number 5. According to the passage, the $800 increase in real income enjoyed by the average family between 1941 and 1946 was primarily the result of what? A. Inflation. B. Government subsidies. C. Decreases in taxes. D. Rising wages and government-controlled prices. Pause the video, have a look, see if you can find that $800 mentioned anywhere in the second paragraph. So if you located the $800 number and read the paragraph again, you could see that number 5, the correct answer is D, rising wages and government-controlled prices. These rising wages gave those consumers more purchasing power. There are 2 more questions for this passage. 6. Which of the following would be the best example of a technological miracle achieved during the Second World War? A. The use of advertising to sell huge numbers of war bonds. B. The development of a rationing system for distributing goods. C. The invention of radar. Or D. The implementation of price controls. You don't really need to look at the passage again to think about which one is correct. Just think about the concepts and which one of these would be an example of a technological miracle. C, the invention of radar, would be the most accurately described as a technological miracle. Okay, for question number 7, please go ahead and read the question and the answers. Pause the video, and then we'll discuss which one is the correct answer. So based on the information in this passage, it could be concluded that an important factor in the growth of the United States economy in the middle of the 20th century was A. Inflation. B. The rise of consumer spending after the war. C. A change in the ownership of many businesses. Or D. The development of economic indicators, such as the GNP. What do you think the correct answer is? Well, the correct answer is the rise of consumer spending after the war. The passage talks heavily about how the control of prices and the increased spending power of consumers led to the explosion of the economy after the war. The war was in the middle of the 20th century. Okay, here we have an explanation of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 above, and 2 different newspapers' opinions about it. Please go ahead and read this article. I'm not going to read the whole article. Pause the screen and read it all. Read both articles, and then we'll talk about the questions. Okay, so the article talks about labor unions. The explanation above tells us about the act and its effect on unions. We're dealing with 2 types of shops, open shops and closed shops. Open shops being that not all of the employees in the shop are members of the union, and a closed shop being that all of the members of the shop are also members of the union. Employees of the shop are members of the union. They both have opposite opinions. Let's have a look at the questions. Number 8 says, which of the following would have been the likely result of the repeal of Section 14B? Now, if you're taking the test, this passage is going to be right above. You can go back and look for the usage of 14B. Where was it mentioned? Section 14B is in the first paragraph. Section 14B is in the second paragraph. You can have a look through those 2 paragraphs and decide what would happen if Section B were to be repealed. So A is an improvement in labor management relations. B, less frequent strikes. C, a decrease in union power, or D, an increase in union power? The correct answer is D. This would create an increase in union power. A decrease in union power would not be called for because Article X is advocating for the repeal of Section 14B and explaining how it will increase union power and help benefit the workers and benefit production. It would lead to less frequent strikes, perhaps, but that's not as likely as the guaranteed increase in union power. And an improvement in labor management relations is highly unlikely since it would give labor the upper hand over management. Question number 9. The views expressed by newspaper X were probably most similar to those of A, a lobbyist for a business organization, B, the president of a large corporation, C, an official of a large union, or D, the governor of a right-to-work state. Let's go ahead and pull this article back up. You can pause the screen, read it, and see which one of those people you think would have the same opinions as newspaper X. Okay. So the correct answer for number 9 is C, an official of a large union. This paragraph is obviously advocating for unions, and a lobbyist for a business organization or the president of a large corporation would be against unions because they give it less bargaining power with the workers. Although the governor of a right-to-work state may agree with that, that would be only a small part of his platform. Question 10. Which of the following did newspaper X claim as a disadvantage of open shops? So all we have to do is go back to the passage, pause it for a second. You can look at it and find the disadvantage. Okay, I'm assuming you've had a chance to look through it now. So A, workers were more likely to quit their jobs. B, strikes tended to be of long duration. C, workers often went on strike without warning. Or D, workers gave notice before going on strike. This question requires you to look at the text and infer the meaning of one of the terms used. In the first or second paragraph, let me look. Well, I cannot find it now, but I do remember in newspaper X they call these wildcat strikes. And we can infer that a wildcat strike would be, I found it, it's in the first paragraph. Dissatisfaction and wildcat strikes. We can infer that wildcat would be, well, wild and unpredictable. So, C, workers often went on strike without warning. Looking at question 11, newspaper Y apparently supported what? You can pause, have a look through newspaper Y's opinion again. We'll go back now and read the possible answers. So A was barring non-union members from joining unions. B, the abolition of labor unions. C, the repeal of Section 14B. Or D, limiting the power of labor unions. Since we know that they are against the repeal of Section 14B, we can cross C off our list. They never mentioned the abolition of labor unions, although they may have been of that opinion. The text does not support that. A, barring non-union members from joining the union, also is not mentioned in there. So D is the implied answer that they would be against, limiting the powers of labor unions. Number 12, newspaper Y considered the right to work laws to be similar in intent to laws that A, provide federal aid to education, B, regulate immigration, C, protect citizens' rights, or D, deal with the nation's defense? You can pause this, look at the section of Newspaper Y again, and decide what you think is correct. So number 12, the answer is C. They advocated for it similarly to how we would protect citizens' civil rights. Question 13. At the time of the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, unions were exempt from some of the laws that regulated big businesses. Which of the two newspapers provided written editorials would probably have favored more regulation of unions? This one we can use our critical thinking skills. Pause it, think about it, but I'm just going to tell you right away that newspaper Y would only favor more regulation of unions. Newspaper X would have been against regulation of unions. And there's nowhere that both newspaper X and Y would agree, because they offer opposite sides of the same argument. And D doesn't make sense since Y was so obvious for it. Okay, so away from the text, and now we have a diagram about winds. This is a geography question. This is judging your ability to read the information and then extrapolate on it with these questions here. Number 14. This is pretty challenging, but if you can find information well and in a diagram, it shouldn't be too bad. This is a good skill. Make sure you keep practicing reading diagrams, charts, maps, graphs, tables. You want to be able to look for the information quick. Remember, you're going to have roughly a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes if you're lucky per question. So 14 says, wind patterns are determined primarily by areas of pressure. If winds tend to move from high pressure areas to low pressure areas, which of the following most likely describes the usual pressure conditions at the South Pole and latitude 60 degrees south? So go ahead and look at that again. You can pause the screen, look for 60 degrees latitude south. I'm assuming you pause the screen. So there's not much thinking here. You just identify the numbers and where they are placed in the diagram. It's D. The pole of high pressure, 60 degrees south, low pressure. That's it. Which of the following most accurately describes the direction of the winds between 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north? This one we're looking for directions. So keep in mind we're looking for which direction. So you're looking for 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north. Which direction are the winds moving? And the winds are moving northeast. You can see here that the arrows are moving up and to the right side. Here we have another type of media. We have an advertisement. So, spring aftershave. Read about spring aftershave and what they want you to believe about the product beneath. Pause the video if you need more time to read it. Let's jump right into the questions. Number 16 says, this ad attempts to sell spring aftershave by emphasizing its A, effectiveness, B, popularity, C, value, or D, appealing fragrance. Give it some thought. Pause if you need to. We're just going to go right into it though. So they're trying to appeal to us using popularity. If we have a look, there's nothing telling us the price. So clearly value would not be what they're selling. D, appealing fragrance. They don't mention the fragrance at all. The only possible indication of fragrance is that little piece of fruit, which looks like a peach or a cherry. And effectiveness, they do not mention the effectiveness in any way. So it's just 7 out of 10 men. 70% love it. It's going to be great. Go buy some now. On the basis of this ad, which of the following conclusions is most reasonable? A. Some men prefer spring to other aftershave products. Some men. B. 70% of all men use spring. C. 3 out of 10 men prefer no aftershave product. Or D. All men use aftershave products. Have a look. Can you find out how many men use this product? The answer is B. 70% of all men use spring. I accidentally told you when I was talking about it earlier. And we can guess that by 7 out of 10 is 70%. Luckily for you, if you get an advertisement like this, it's quite simple. 18. Consider the statement below. This requires you to have some factual-based knowledge about opinions, observations, facts, and conclusions. We need to understand what those terms mean. So, the statement is, the worst crime being committed today is the treatment of victims by the court system. Have a thought. Is that an observation, an opinion, an established fact, or a scientific conclusion? Go ahead, pause the video if you need more time. This would be B, an opinion. Worst is a subjective term. It's not concrete. What I think is the worst and what you think of the worst may not be exactly equal. An observation would be giving us some sort of descriptive quality that we could measure. An opinion is just a feeling. That is, something is the worst or the best. An established fact would give us some sort of number or something we could reference with a document or a physical characteristic of something. A scientific conclusion would have to be much more convincing than this, and it would use some facts or theories. 19. Which of the following questions about a state's budget would be most difficult to answer? And why would it be most difficult to answer? This is drawing on the same terminology we used above. So I'm going to read the questions. You can pause the video and read on your own. A. Did the state provide enough money for education this year? B. Did education receive the greatest proportion of the state's budget this year? C. Was the amount of money provided for education this year greater than it was last year? Or D. How much money did the state provide for education this year? Okay, I hope you paused the video to think about it if you'd like to answer on your own. The correct answer for this would be A. Did the state provide enough money for education this year? This is the most difficult to answer because it is an opinion. Enough money for education would be based on your opinion about the value of education, how much was spent, other considerations in the budget. It's not something we can measure with facts. It would lead to argument, in fact, if you tried to pinpoint if it was enough or not enough. B. Did education receive the greatest proportion of the state's budget? We could measure this with facts. It would be simple to see if they spent the most dollar amount on education out of all expenditures. C. Was the amount provided greater than last year? This, again, we can establish with two facts. How much was spent last year? How much was spent this year? If it's more, we'd know. D. How much money did the state provide for education this year? That would be the simplest fact yet. Okay, number 20. 3 of the following statements about the Vietnam War are based on direct evidence. Which statement is based primarily on circumstantial evidence or inference? This question, again, is dealing with fact versus opinion. There is a challenging vocabulary word here, circumstantial evidence. You can use the context of the sentence, the root of the word, the use of inference. to decide what it means if you don't know, let's go into the questions. Into the answers. A. In 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. B. In 1965, President Johnson ordered the U.S. combat units into battle in Vietnam, and U.S. military involvement ended in 1973. C. Lack of military success in Vietnam led to President Johnson's decision not to run for re-election in 1968. D. President Eisenhower sent military advisors to Vietnam in the 1950s. Pause the video, give it some thought. Okay. So a lot of these answers we could base on physical evidence. There would be memorandums, there would be numbers. So A, more than 500 American soldiers were in Vietnam in 1968. We could prove this with actual evidence, physical evidence. There would be a memorandum, there would be news articles, we'd have both primary and secondary sources. In 1965, President Johnson ordered U.S. combat units into battle in Vietnam, and the military involvement ended in 1973. Again, we would have a declaration of war, which would have a year on it. We would have newspaper articles, magazine articles for both the withdrawal of troops and the ending of military involvement and the beginning of it. This has real hard facts. Lack of military success in Vietnam led to President Johnson's decision not to run for re-election in 1968. This information would be quite circumstantial. We would be depending on, unless we had a direct piece of evidence of President Johnson saying this publicly, this would be based on beliefs, observations, and our thoughts about it rather than hard facts. D. President Eisenhower sent military advisors to Vietnam in the 1950s. Again, we will have men on planes. There will be numbers. So C is based primarily on circumstantial evidence. Here we have a timeline. Pause the video and have a look through. We're going to answer the questions about the timeline now. 21. Which of the following titles would best represent the theme of this timeline? A. Federal Education Legislation, 1944 to 1965. B. Defense and Economic Legislation, 1944 to 1965. C. Effects of Education on Social Change, 1944 to 1965. D. Effects of Education on the Economy, 1944 to 1965. If we look back at this timeline, we will see that there is no mention of the effects of education on social change or the economy. C and D are not likely candidates for a good title. If we look carefully now, we will see that each of these acts is about education. None of them is about defense. Although we have national defense education, it's still educational. So, A, Federal Education Legislation would be the best title for this timeline. 22. Concern about national security was the most likely motive for the act passed in 1944. A. B. 1958. C. 1964. Or D. 1965. Concern about national security. Have a look. Which of these acts do you think was most in response to national security? B. 1958. If we look here, the National Defense Act, it's titled Defense. This is pretty obvious. And beyond helping veterans and beyond helping those who are in low-income families, the things that were provided money for, such as science, mathematics, and modern languages, are useful for the defense of the country. Number 23, the two acts that seem most concerned with social inequalities are those passed in which years? Go ahead and look at the acts and notice which ones are most concerned with low income. The answer for this question is D, 1964 and 1965. Have a look. The Economic Opportunity Act is helping out low-income families to succeed in school. And the Elementary School Education Act provided funds for the education of children from low-income families. Number 24, which of the following world events was probably the primary reason for the 1958 Act? We're going to go back and look at that act. 1958 was the National Defense Education Act, which provided funds to improve teaching in mathematics, science, and modern languages. So was it probably the reason? Which was probably the reason? The Soviet Union sent troops to Hungary. A. Or B. Power generated from atomic energy was first used in the United States. C. The International Atomic Energy Agency was established. Or D. The Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite. This is asking you to draw conclusions and think about the effects of these events and what would be required to respond to them. The correct answer is D. The Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite. Launching a satellite by your Cold War enemy would definitely encourage you to try to get your children to be better at mathematics, science, and modern languages, so you can exceed their technological advancements. 25. Consider the two statements below. We want to look at the bold beneath it so we can understand it as we read it a little better in context. Which of these statements, if either, does this timeline support? So the timeline is about education. Option 1 says, from 1944 to 1965, the only educational programs to receive financial support from the United States government were those for elementary and secondary students. 2. From 1944 to 1965, the United States government provided more financial support for national security than for education. So which do you think the timeline supports? A, number 1 only, B, number 2 only, C, both 1 and 2, or D, neither 1 nor 2. Pause the video, have a look at the timeline again. Pause the video, read about these acts. You can read those statements again. In fact, I would have to say that D, neither 1 nor 2, are supported by the timeline. There are just too many things that aren't true in both of them. And I think that if you have gotten this far in the test already, it'll be pretty easy for you to guess those. But these kind of questions can be tricky. Whenever you see both 1 and 2 or neither 1 and 2, it could slow you down. It's going to lead to second guessing. To stay confident in all of your test-taking endeavors, as always, best of luck with your GED test success. Take care.